Somewhere in the archives of American labor history, there is a report written by a man whose name no one recorded. He had worked inside the Winchester factory in New Haven, Connecticut. He had watched what happened on that floor. And before the damage was done, before the finest bolt-action rifle in America was quietly gutted in the name of cost reduction, he put down in writing what was wrong and what it meant. Nobody in management listened. The rifle paid for it. And the man who tried to warn them passed into history without so much as a byline. This is the story of the rifleman's rifle, and the story of the man the company chose not to hear. The Winchester Model 70 arrived on dealers' racks in 1937, and from the first season it was in American hands. Hunters understood they were holding something different. The action drew on principles from the Mauser 98, the design that serious riflemen considered the engineering standard by which all bolt actions would be judged. At the center of that action sat a claw extractor, a heavy, non-rotating hook machined into the bolt head that reached out and gripped each cartridge the moment it left the magazine. That cartridge did not slide or tumble or push. It was controlled, seized and guided from magazine lips to chamber in a single, unbroken motion. That distinction mattered in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who has never stood in elk country with one shot left and a rifle that won't feed. The claw extractor was not a feature on a brochure. It was a promise about what the rifle would do when conditions were worst and the margin for error was zero. American hunters recognized that promise. They trusted it. Beyond the action, the pre-war guns were fitted by hand. Every component that mattered was touched by a machinist at some point, lapped, adjusted, verified. The checkering on the walnut stock was cut by hand. The trigger broke cleanly. The metal was polished and blued to a depth that told you something about the man who had done it. These were not assembly line products in the sense that term is usually meant. They were production rifles made with the patience of custom work. Gunwriter Jack O'Connor, who spent decades writing for Outdoor Life and who had built his reputation partly around the .270 Winchester cartridge fired through a pre-war Model 70, called it his rifle. He was not a man given to extravagant praise. When Jack O'Connor said a rifle was his rifle, that was the highest rating the American sporting press could offer. By the late 1940s, the marketplace had confirmed everything O'Connor had written. The Model 70 was the rifleman's rifle, not as a marketing language, as a fact. The New Haven factory that built it had been the center of Winchester's operation for generations. At the height of the Second World War, more than 19,000 workers passed through its gates. The machinists, stockers, assemblers and inspectors who made the Model 70 were craftsmen in the full sense of that word, not because management had designed a system that produced craftsmanship, but because those workers had compensated every shift for equipment that should have been modernized years before. This is where the unnamed man's report becomes the most important document in this story. He had worked that floor. He had seen what the work required. And at some point before the decisions that would wreck the rifle were finalized, he wrote it down. The report was detailed enough that it survived him, that it was later cited in scholarly research drawn from labor archives in New Haven and published through Yale University Press. His name did not survive with it. What the report described was a factory operating on the edge of what was mechanically possible. Milling was done, he wrote, on Lincoln machines so old that no one could recall when they had been introduced. Springs were hand-wound, hand-treated, and hand-tested. These processes, he noted, were incapable of producing dimensions within the tolerances required to manufacture interchangeable components. Rifles moved constantly between the test range and the assembly area, built, rejected, rebuilt, sent back, rebuilt again. That last detail is the one that changes how you understand the pre-64 Model 70. The quality of those rifles did not come from Winchester's manufacturing system. It came from Winchester's workers overriding the limitations of that system with their own skill and patience. Every rifle that left New Haven in the condition it was supposed to leave did so because a machinist had spent time on it that the ledger never accounted for. Because someone, possibly the man who wrote this report, possibly men like him, had rebuilt it until it was right. What the unnamed worker understood, and what his report makes explicit, is this. The reputation of the Winchester Model 70 was not a corporate asset that management owned. It was a product of human labor that management was failing to adequately support. And if the factory's direction continued, if the response to rising costs was to strip away the craftsmanship rather than invest in the machinery that made craftsmanship possible, the reputation would follow the craftsmanship out the door. He was right. He was ignored. In 1955, the New Haven machinists organized themselves as Local 609 of the International Association of Machinists. The company had resisted unionization for years, but the campaign that finally succeeded gave the men on the floor something they had not had before: a formal voice for the same arguments the unnamed worker had put in writing. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, that voice kept returning to the same subject. The machinery was aging. The tooling was worn. The tolerances management expected were not achievable on equipment that dated, in some cases, to an era before the workers themselves had been born. Management heard this as a complaint about production quotas and labor costs. What it was the same warning the unnamed man had already committed to paper, that the product depended on human compensation for the factory's mechanical failures, and that if you removed the conditions that made that compensation possible, you would destroy the product. Winchester's management was looking at a different set of numbers. Remington had spent the post-war years applying wartime mass production methods to civilian sporting rifles. The result, the Model 700, introduced in 1962, could be produced faster, with less labor, and sold at roughly 30% below the Model 70's price point, while delivering accuracy that hunters found entirely acceptable. Winchester was losing money on its flagship rifle. The Olin Corporation, which had owned Winchester since 1931, needed the economics to change. The decision reached in the early 1960s was not to invest in modern machinery, address the conditions the machinists had been flagging, and build the Model 70 better. The decision was to redesign the rifle to require less skill and less time to build. The unnamed worker had said the product depended on craftsmen compensating for the factory's limits. Management's answer was to engineer away the features that made that compensation necessary. In 1964, the new Model 70 arrived. The claw extractor, the Mauser-type controlled round-feed mechanism that had defined the rifle for nearly 3 decades and anchored the trust of a generation of American hunters, was removed. In its place went a small wedge-type push-feed extractor. The cartridge was no longer gripped and guided. It was pushed from behind and expected to chamber on its own. The design was mechanically simpler and cheaper to produce. It was also the feature that, above all others, the American hunting public associated with what a Winchester was supposed to mean. The trigger guard and floor plate, previously machined from steel and hand-fitted to each rifle, became a single stamped piece. The hand-cut checkering on the walnut stock was replaced by impressed checkering pressed into the wood by machine. Receivers that had been machined from bar stock were simplified. The total number of manufacturing steps required dropped substantially, which was precisely what the ledger had demanded. What the ledger had not modelled was the speed and completeness of the public's rejection. Jack O'Connor, who had written about the Model 70 for more than 20 years, described his reaction when Winchester informed him of the changes. He told them he was glad to know, so he could lay in 4 or 5 of the old ones before they ruined it. Then he saw the pilot model. At the first glimpse, he later wrote, he nearly fell into a swoon. The action was simplified. The trigger guard and floor plate looked flimsy. Hunters across the country reached the same conclusion without needing O'Connor to write a word. Men who had carried the Model 70 into elk country and sheep country and bear country. Men who had staked real confidence in that claw extractor under conditions where a misfeeding rifle meant a wasted season at best, looked at the new gun and turned to the used market. Pre-64 Model 70s, which had been working hunting rifles the morning before, were suddenly collector items. Dealers who understood what was happening pulled them from the racks. Prices climbed. The market delivered its verdict the same year the new gun arrived. The damage proved deeper than management had anticipated. The post-64 Model 70 was not a dangerous rifle. O'Connor himself eventually acknowledged that in most hunting applications it performed adequately. The push-feed extractor seldom caused problems, and the action was in some respects mechanically stronger than its predecessor. But adequate was not the standard the Model 70 had established. Adequate was not what 3 decades of reputation had promised. And in the American hunting market, a rifle's reputation is not a marketing asset that a company manages. It is a trust that the man in the field has extended to the people who built his gun. Winchester had broken that trust to save money on a stamped floor plate. Beginning around 1968, the company began trying to repair what it could. Metal finishing improved, parts fit tightened. Cut checkering returned to some models. These were genuine improvements, and they made a real difference to shooters who came to the rifle without 30 years of expectation attached to the name. The two-tier market that had opened in 1964, however, old rifles commanding a premium, new rifles selling on their merits alone, was now a permanent feature of the Winchester landscape. No incremental improvement to the post-64 guns was going to close it. In 1969, the machinists of Local 609 went on strike. The settlement produced a contract provision called Article 4, which protected workers against production quotas. From the union side, the reasoning was the same reasoning the unnamed worker had put in his report years earlier. Quotas were unfair when the machinery wasn't reliable. The warning had not changed, only the venue had. This time, it was written into a contract rather than a report that no one acted on. The factory continued to decline. Oling Corporation, watching the losses compound through the post-Vietnam years, had come to view New Haven as an unsustainable cost. A second strike in 1979 brought police to the picket lines and ended with arrests. It convinced Olin that exit was the only rational remaining option. In 1981, the New Haven facility was sold to a company called U.S. Repeating Arms. That firm passed eventually to Browning and then to the Belgian manufacturer F.N. Herstal. In 2006, the last Winchester rifles built in New Haven came off the line. The factory that had employed 19,000 people at its wartime peak closed with fewer than 200 workers inside. The Winchester name survived. The New Haven factory did not. 1992. 28 years after the decision that the unnamed worker had seen coming. Winchester brought back controlled round feeding. The claw extractor returned. The separate bolt stop was restored. The rifle produced under the classic designation was built on the same mechanical principles the pre-64 guns had used. The principles the men on the floor had argued for years were not optional features to be weighed against cost. They were what the rifle was. The engineering that management had discarded as too expensive to produce in 1964 was now the centerpiece of Winchester's marketing for the new model. The company made no public statement acknowledging that the 1964 decision had been wrong. The reversal itself said what needed to be said. The market responded. Hunters who had paid collector prices for old pre-64 rifles for nearly 3 decades had a path, at last, to a new gun built on the same foundation. In 1999, Shooting Times magazine named the Winchester Model 70 the bolt-action rifle of the century. The unnamed worker had said it would come to this. He said it in a report detailed enough to survive in Labour archives for decades, specific enough to be cited in serious scholarship, and accurate enough that every prediction in it was eventually confirmed by the market. He said it without a byline, without a public platform, without a name attached to the warning that history would remember. He was a man on a factory floor who understood what he was building and understood what would happen if the people above him stopped respecting what that building required. He knew that the Winchester Model 70's reputation lived in the claw extractor, in the hand-cut checkering, in the extra time a machinist spent on a rifle that came back from the range wrong and had to be made right. He knew that you could not stamp that out of sheet metal and press it into wood and call it the same thing. He knew, because he had spent his working life inside the proof of it. Management chose the ledger. The market chose the rifle. And the man whose name no one recorded, the factory worker who put the warning in writing before anyone in a boardroom was willing to hear it, was proven right in the only way that ultimately matters, completely. And too late for the factory that ignored him.